Ernie, and some others who might have taken a hit on that front. We've still got a ways to go with guys declaring and signing agents, so it'll still be a while before we fully know who's going to be in this draft pool. The league has announced that the lottery will be held on June 22nd, with the draft combine from the 21st to the 27th, and the NBA draft on July 29th. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the guys who just missed the cut on this big board. This is definitely the biggest list of missed the cut players that I'm going to do. I'm sure there are still a few others I didn't mention here, but this covers most of the draft hopefuls. Depending on the teams in the back half of the second round, you could and probably should be seeing a good amount of these names. Let's go ahead and start with number 60 and the last tier of this big board. You guys have heard me talk about Providence's David Duke many times at this point. I think the biggest thing that held him back from being higher in these boards was his performance in the second half of the season, especially as a shooter. If he can show he's closer to the guy from the beginning of the year, teams will have a lot more confidence in him as a prospect and as someone who could stick around in the league. McKinley Wright IV is an NBA player. I don't know if he'll end up being drafted, but I'd be surprised if he doesn't spend some time on the big stage. He's a floor general and does a lot of little things that won't show up on a stat sheet. And despite being undersized, I really like his game on both ends, and he's definitely on the list of guys you want to play with. It was a great final performance for Luka Garza to end his college career. While I know he would have liked to make a deeper tournament run, it happens. Big Ten basketball and the NBA are two very different games. Garza's role and responsibility at the next level will be wildly different. His weaknesses as a defender will be attacked, and I just don't know if that gets you higher than a second round pick in the modern NBA. Neemias Queta is entering the draft and foregoing his senior season. He's a 7-footer with a 7'4" wingspan and the tools to be a rotational big in the league. As bigs go, he's among the best outside of the obvious ones, and teams who need a rim runner and shot blocker will likely call on Queta on draft night. Vrins Blaenberg is an interesting talent out of Belgium. He's about 6'10" with a 7'2" wingspan and wiry at just about 200 pounds. He's a really compelling passer, moves well for his size, and I think he'll make a lot of noise once teams really get involved in their pre-draft processes. Jason Preston's magic fell just a little short this year. He'll likely be a second round pick if he comes out this year, but I easily think he could be a first round guy next year. He's in the upper echelon of passers in this class, and while there are some things he really needs to improve upon, I think he's a future NBA player. Herb Jones is one of the most versatile defenders in the draft. He was a bit underwhelming in what was likely his last collegiate game, especially offensively and from the free throw line, but he can play. He's a probable second round guy. I think Michigan probably ends up in the Final Four pretty comfortably if Isaiah Livers was available. They needed an extra spark on the perimeter, and he certainly would have been a better late game option over Franz. Regardless, Livers has bigger things ahead of him and had a great career anyways. Sandro Mamukelashvili is about as unique a player there is in this class. He's one of the toughest players for me to decide where to rank in a macro big board setting. It'll only take you about 1 minute of watching his games to know there's a lot there, but there are a few things that concern me when it comes to projecting him. Julian Champagnie is exploring his draft options as he should. I'm really not sure what he'll ultimately decide to do. There's a slim chance he'll be a first round pick this year, and I think he'll only raise his stock next year, but you never know. He's a talented 4 or 3 man, especially offensively, and he's surely garnered enough respect to get drafted this year. A quick recap of Tier 9. I probably expect this area to change the most by draft time. I could see David Johnson going anywhere in the second round. He's got a solid all-around game, and he's shown that well over these last 2 years, but he's still left quite a bit to be desired, especially as a scorer and just an offense initiator. Duke's DJ Stewart has declared for the draft. Now, it has been a big discussion as to whether or not he would, but I think with all the guys coming in for Duke next year, he made the right decision. I ultimately think he'll end up being a really good value pick in the second round. He had some moments of a potential first round talent, though he never quite put it all together. Now, JT Thor is going to test the NBA draft process, which still leaves things up in the air for him. He's already a really interesting prospect, but he's another one I think could possibly really benefit from being a focal point in a good college system before declaring next year. Now, that's not always the case, but I think it could make sense for him. If you've enjoyed watching Goran Dragic play at any point these last 10 plus years, you'll like Rokas Jokubaitis. He's putting up per 36 numbers of about 12, 3, and 5 in the EuroLeague. He's still not the 3-point shooter I hoped he'd develop into this year, but it's not a true negative area for him. You can make an argument that nobody in the basketball world has made a better decision over the last year than Johnny Juzang. In hindsight, it's wild that he was just an outcast at Kentucky a year ago, especially after being a highly touted recruit. And then he just absolutely lit up the NCAA tournament, and the Bruins needed every bit of it, even through the injuries. I think he's a legitimate NBA prospect, whether he goes this year or next year. Charles Bassey is right up there at the top for me in terms of bigs. There's a reason he was a top 10 recruit coming out of high school, and those 18 points, 12 rebounds, and 3 blocks a game were no fluke this season. He blocks shots, rebounds, brings energy, and has potential as a shooter. The first round really isn't too far-fetched for him. The last 14 games of the season, Aaron Henry was on a great run. He put up 18 points, 6 boards, 4 assists, a steal, and a block while shooting 40% from 3. Not to mention he led the Spartans into the tournament after that looked quite unlikely around the mid-season mark. Here's a look back at Tier 8. Not much has changed with guys like Daishen Nix, Terrence Clarke, and Isaiah Todd. We're pretty much seen and heard as much as we're going to from them at this point. All three have a lot of upside. The G League guys have experience in and around the NBA, while Clarke is going to need to show and prove a bit more in workouts given he was robbed of a ton of his freshman season due to injury. Until the league for some reason goes away from 3-and-D wings with great size who don't need the ball to be effective, guys like Trey Murphy will be in high demand. Virginia wasn't particularly popular this year, and they lost to Ohio in the tourney, so it's understandable if you haven't seen much of him yet, but he's someone I think teams will be a big fan of. Joel Ayayi played his way into early second, late first round contention down the stretch of Gonzaga's run. He started shooting the ball at a level I wasn't sure he was capable, taking about 4 a game at nearly 47% over his last 12 games. He's a great mover without the ball, does the little things, and makes plays for others. I for sure have fatigue from talking about Marcus Bagley since it's been so long since we've actually seen him play. It's not a great track record to stand on, and it's obviously a bit hyperbolic. But if Lou Dort's any indication of what happens to you when you leave Tempe, both Bagley and Christopher might have something substantial waiting on them in the league. Jeremiah Robinson Earl continues to be a really solid option at the 4 spot. Nothing he does is super flashy, but he can do multiple things on the court, always makes the right play, and made great improvements from year 1 to year 2. Villanova always churns out contributors, and I think the former Bishop Miege KC Run GMC standout is up next. Greg Brown is going to be another guy who we see ranked all over the place. Could Chris Beard be convincing him to stay another year in Austin? Possibly. There's always going to be a big adjustment to the NBA, so I usually lean towards just making that jump. But in Greg Brown's case, I think a year being the focal point of a team could do wonders for him and help slow the game down. The talent is there, so we'll see what happens. Tier 7 has quite a bit of talent in it. Terrence Shannon is a borderline first round pick to me. If a team needs energy and effort from a slashing wing, he's the guy. He's still a bit inconsistent from deep, but he made great improvements and shot nearly 40% on 3 attempts over the last 13 games. If you guys see odds for Kessler Edwards ending up in Memphis, take them ASAP. He's a guy that'll probably fly under the radar being from Pepperdine, but he's a strong forward prospect who continuously put his abilities on display this season. He's low usage, low maintenance, and high impact on both ends. Although he hasn't exactly become an overly popular draft name just yet, Ben Mathurin has real first round potential in this year's draft. It was a weird season for Arizona, a program that is usually a staple in the top 25, but Mathurin was a big bright spot, at least in terms of NBA potential. BJ Boston is a talented dude, but just didn't perform to his expectations. He's still a great scoring talent that's going to take some time to develop physically and confidence-wise. Aside from where the top guys land team-wise, there's nothing I'm more interested to see than at what point in the draft BJ Boston is selected. We were absolutely robbed from watching Bones Hyland play in the tournament. We watched guys like Jason Preston, Max Abmas, and Johnny Juzang become big stars, and I had all the confidence Bones was going to do it as well, at least in the first game. He's still a dynamic scoring guard with a great mentality. I don't care what it is, putting up 23 points a game as a freshman in the SEC is a legitimate accomplishment. Cam Thomas can get buckets, and I think he'll only get better at it. Depending on how the teams shake out in the first round, I can see him going anywhere from the late teens to the early second round. Although he did have a great season, all of Ayo Dosunmu's major weaknesses came to light in his team's biggest moment of the year. He gets stripped going to the basket more than any player in this class by far, and getting his own shot can be a struggle at times. I'm excited to see him out of the Big Ten, but for me, mid to late first is more appropriate than potential lottery pick. It wasn't the best conclusion to a season for West Virginia, but Deuce McBride became a legitimate NBA prospect over the course of it. He's pretty much a lock as a terrific defender on and off the ball, and has high potential as a shot creator should he patch a few things up. Watch his first half against Oklahoma State in the Big 12 tourney, at home versus Kansas, and against Morehead State to see him at his best. Day'Ron Sharpe averaged a staggering 22 rebounds per 100 possessions. He's an interior force who happens to be a talented passer, and someone I think will shine outside of that UNC system. He's not a shooter, but I like his all-around potential going back to his days with the Montverde Lotto pick last year. Isaiah Jackson seems to be looking for a lottery guarantee according to his dad Wesley Jackson in a piece recently done by The Athletic. I don't know if he's going to get that this year, but it could end up being pretty close once the order shakes out. If he decides to go back to Kentucky, he'd definitely be in my top 10 to start the year. You have to be really good to get in this area in spite of being older than guys like Lonzo and Jason Tatum, and Chris Duarte is. He was pretty clearly one of the best players in the Pac-12 on both ends this year. He's a 42% three-point shooter and a great competitor. It's going to be tough for teams outside the lottery to pass him up. Tier 6 has some of my personal favorites in it. Corey Kispert had about as good a college career as you could dream of. He played with a lot of talent up at Gonzaga and eventually played for a near undefeated team that was just a bit short of running the table. I don't necessarily think much differently about him as a player, but just some rethinking dropped him down to an area and tier I'm more comfortable having a guy like him in. Roko Prkačin has recently had several dunks that'll take you right out your seat. He has great size and he just looks more comfortable in his body than he did in the past, and it really shows. He recently put up a nearly 30-point, 15-rebound triple-double. While Jared Butler got off to a rocky start to Baylor's eventual national championship tournament run, he bounced back in a big way in the Final Four and really brought it home for that team. He's about as solid a prospect there is in this draft, and teams in the late teens to 20s will be hard-pressed to find a safer bet. Usman Garuba consistently displays elite defensive abilities at a young age in the second best league in the world, and I'm sure teams will be able to overlook his rawness offensively to get him. Arizona State's Josh Christopher has officially declared for the draft. I think he has the potential to be one of those Jaden McDaniels, Kevin Porter Jr. type of guys who many soured on by the end of their freshman seasons, but immediately made impacts in the league and show that they have bright futures. Alperen Sengun hasn't slowed down one bit. He's still consistently putting up nearly 20 and 10 a game, scoring the ball in a few ways, being a good passer, and a positive defender. I'm excited to see how the rest of Josh Giddey's season pans out, coming off of this ankle injury and where he ends up landing in the draft. He's in that top group of playmakers, and that ability has shown through over his last 6 games, putting up a total of 57 dimes. He has a chance to add to the NBL's group of recent prospects with LaMelo Ball and RJ Hampton. There's an interesting group of international talent and college stars here in Tier 5. That was a rough end to a season for Franz Wagner. The wide open airball 3 and the missed game winner at the buzzer, on top of what was a struggle of a game for him in general, just wasn't the way you would want to go out. That'll be the lasting impression for a lot of people, but he's still a late lottery mid-teens guy for me, given his ability to affect the game in multiple ways, most importantly as a defender, spot shooter, and passer. A player like Sharife Cooper has high potential to fall in the draft despite being super talented just based on his physical attributes and weaknesses as a scorer, but there are few as dynamic as he is in this class. James Bouknight is another guy who had a great season, though the ending was quite underwhelming. He's a scoring guard with good size at 6'5", he's a solid defender, and just someone I'm confident in becoming a solid contributor in the league. Davion Mitchell was great all season long. While myself and many others initially had their eye on Jared Butler, Mitchell continuously proved that he belonged in this conversation despite being an older player. He's an absolutely elite on-ball defender. He's super quick, crafty, unselfish, and a true competitor. There's been some top 10 buzz, but I just don't know if I can go that far. He has been a definite first rounder for me for a while though. It's pretty easy to forget about Jalen Johnson at this point, but he's still there and has some of the most raw talent in the draft. There are still a lot of questions about the entirety of his game, but it gets a lot tougher to pass him up as you get towards the end of the lottery. Kai Jones remains one of the most interesting players in the class. He's a great athlete at the 4 or 5, and he can keep up with pretty much anybody defensively. Offensively, while he's still raw, he's shown some encouraging flashes, especially on the perimeter, that'll likely land him in the lottery. Tre Mann had a great home stretch to his sophomore season at Florida and has further climbed into the lottery for me. He has some of the most raw talent in the pick and roll and as an isolation shot creator. I'm willing to bet on his growth curve, especially being that he really just grew into his body over the past year. After what was a terrific conference tournament, Scottie Barnes took a bit of a step back in the big dance. It's nothing we haven't talked about before, but he's pretty dependent on being the primary ball handler, or at least majorly involved to be effective offensively, which is why shooting and situation are going to be huge swing factors for him. Defensively, you know it's there, and we've talked a lot about the energy he brings. While he hasn't necessarily garnered that widespread respect, I think Jaden Springer is very much in the lottery conversation. He's a great athlete, and what he can do defensively give him a baseline that should intrigue a lot of teams. He's not the most talented scorer, and there's definitely more for him to work on offensively, but he's about as solid a prospect there is in this range. Zaire Williams officially declared for the draft after just one season at Stanford. He never really got in a rhythm at the end of the season after missing some time due to a bunch of things. He's got high potential on both ends despite what was an up and down season. Moses Moody didn't have the best inning, but he's still a top 10 guy. There weren't any things that he showed against Oral Roberts or Baylor that would cause me to ultimately jump ship on a guy who projects as a solid 3-and-D guy at worst, with a lot more potential to his game. He's going to need to make strides as a finisher and athletically, but there aren't a ton of 19-year-olds showing what he showed this year. Down the stretch of the season, Keon Johnson was quietly really good. The last 11 games, all of which he started, he put up nearly 15 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists, and a steal on 46% from the field and 76% from the line. He's by no means a finished product, but I like his potential on both ends on the wing. I think Jonathan Kuminga belongs right outside that top 4. It's a little weird because I feel like all players who didn't make multiple game tournament runs sort of fly under the radar until draft time, but Kuminga is still one of the better prospects in the class, and especially given that he should be graduating high school right now. Tier 1 and Tier 2 remain the same at the moment, with the Jalen's manning that second tier. Jalen Suggs put together a really great one-and-done season. Not only did he perform well and show his NBA potential, his team put together a tremendous season, and he was a huge piece of that. Suggs had one of the biggest college basketball moments ever in that Final Four game against UCLA, and is not often one of those guys actually warrants being a top 4 pick in the draft. Obviously, the alien level explosiveness and shot creating abilities are there for Jalen Green, but he's also got the it factor and the potential to be a star in a way that many of the guys ranked around him just don't have naturally. If you want more info on the ins and outs of him as a player, definitely go check out the scouting report I did on him recently. And in Tier 1, we have Evan Mobley and Cade Cunningham. Evan Mobley had a great season and tournament run that ended with a matchup with that buzzsaw of a Gonzaga team. He was consistently excellent all season, impacting the game in about every way a freshman big man can, and it warranted him winning Pac-12 Player of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, and Freshman of the Year. The only other person to win all 3 of those conference awards was Anthony Davis. That's good company for him to be in as he continues on that path towards becoming one of the league's most talented bigs. Regardless of what the narrative has sort of transformed into over these last couple weeks, Cade is still at the top of my board. He's become oddly polarizing, and I'm not sure why. I detailed his game in my official scouting report video, so go check that out if you haven't yet, but I don't really understand why you wouldn't want a 6'8" wing/guard who affects the game in more areas than anyone else in the class and still has some areas to improve in despite already being really effective. I'm confident he knows his weaknesses and is likely making them a priority as we speak.